On a night like this, with the steady patter of rain against your window, you could almost believe the world was asleep. But in the tiny village of Evermore, the rain had a voice. People said it carried the whispers of those who walked before us, old souls lingering. Thomas, a quiet man who loved his books more than people, sat by his window, listening to the rain. He'd always found it calming, like the earth itself was sighing. But this Halloween night, it was different. Amid the droplets' rhythm, he heard something strange, a voice, faint but unmistakable. Thomas. It called, soft, like a breeze through the leaves. He didn't flinch. Ever since childhood, the rain had spoken to him. Tonight, though, it wasn't just a murmur. It was a name that no one alive should know. He closed his book, stood and walked to the window. There was no one outside, just the wet, empty streets. But the voice continued, beckoning. "Come to the garden, Thomas." Against his better judgment, he grabbed an umbrella and stepped out into the night. The garden behind his house was overgrown, wild, like something that had forgotten itself. He hadn't tended it in years. At its heart stood an old stone bench where his grandmother used to sit, telling him stories of spirits and lost souls. He approached slowly, the rain still whispering to him. On the bench, he saw it, an old locket, one that had belonged to his grandmother. He hadn't seen it in decades, thought it had been lost with her. He picked it up, and the rain stopped whispering. It was just rain again. Thomas smiled, tucked the locket into his pocket, and turned back toward the house. The air felt lighter now, as if something had finally been set right. He didn't need to know how or why. The night had given him peace, as the rain hummed him softly to sleep. The small town of Raven Hollow loved Halloween. Every year, the villagers would carve the biggest, brightest pumpkins and line them along the streets. Their flickering glow turned the town into a golden wonderland, especially on a night like this, when the rain fell softly, tapping at the windows like a gentle reminder that even darkness could be beautiful. Young Ella had always been fascinated by the pumpkin she found deep in the woods a few years ago. It had grown larger than any she had ever seen, with a smooth, perfect surface. When she carved it, the light inside seemed to burn brighter than any candle could manage, as if the pumpkin itself had a story to tell. Tonight, on Halloween, she set it out on her porch where its glow pierced through the rain. As she sat by the window sipping tea, she noticed something odd. The light from the pumpkin flickered, not as if it were about to go out, but almost like it was moving. Curious, she stepped outside, the rain brushing against her skin like cold fingertips. The pumpkin's glow danced inside, casting strange shadows on the porch. When she looked closer, she saw something remarkable. A face inside the flicker. Not a carved face, but a real one, like a reflection in water. Ella knelt down, mesmerized. The face was soft, gentle, its eyes kind, but ancient. The figure didn't speak, but she understood. This wasn't just any pumpkin. It had been touched by something old. Something from a time when the line between the living and the spirit world was thinner. The glow flickered one last time before fading. The rain fell harder now, but Ella smiled, knowing that her pumpkin had carried a whisper from another world, a fleeting touch of something forgotten yet familiar. As she went back inside, the steady rhythm of the rain lulled her to sleep. On Halloween night, when the rain danced on the rooftops and fog swirled through the streets, there was one house in town that never saw trick-or-treaters. The Whitmore Manor, an old Gothic structure, had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember, its windows dark, its doors firmly shut. But tonight, as you lay in bed listening to the rain on your window, you imagine the stories people tell about the place. They say, on nights like this, when the air is thick with mist, the manor opens its doors, but only for those who are willing to listen. Curious souls who dare to walk up the winding path will find the door ajar and a warm light inside. And if they step in, they'll find themselves in another time, surrounded by people in Victorian garb, holding lanterns, sipping wine, laughing as if they've never left, as if death had simply passed them by. But the house asks for something in return. No one quite knows what it is, but they say when you leave, you always feel a little lighter, a little more tired, as though the house takes a piece of you to stay alive. You're not one for superstition, but tonight, As the rain taps a melody on your window, you wonder what it would be like to walk up that hill, to see if the manor's doors would creak open just for you. But for now, the thought of it is enough, just a passing musing as you curl up under your blanket. The rain has always sung you to sleep, and tonight is no different. As you drift off, the manor stands quietly in the distance, waiting for the next dreamer to come knocking.
Happy Halloween.
It was one of those nights where the rain was more like a constant soft hum, lulling the world into a quiet dream. You lay in bed, listening to the droplets fall on the window pane, letting the rhythm soothe your thoughts. But just as your eyes began to close, you noticed something faint flickering through the curtains, a light. It wasn't the street lights, no, this was something softer, like a lantern swaying gently in the wind. Curious, you pushed back the covers and approached the window. Outside, just beyond the garden wall, stood an old-fashioned lantern, glowing faintly despite the rain. For a moment, you thought it was just your imagination, but then you saw the silhouette. A figure, barely more than a shadow, holding the lantern aloft, standing still in the mist. You rubbed your eyes and looked again, but the figure didn't move. They just stood there, watching the house, the lantern casting a warm glow across the wet ground. You didn't feel fear, just curiosity. This wasn't a haunting, it felt more like an invitation. The figure seemed familiar, though you couldn't place why. Maybe it was someone from an old dream, or a memory that had slipped through the cracks of time. You stood at the window for what felt like minutes, watching the figure. Eventually they turned, the lantern swaying slightly, and began to walk into the fog. You thought for a second about going after them, but the warmth of your bed called you back. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. They'd return again, you felt sure. As you drifted back to sleep, the rain on the window pane took on a comforting rhythm, as though someone out there, holding a lantern, was waiting patiently for the next time you'd step into their world. The clock in the hallway had always been steady, reliable. Every tick was precise, marking time with the same unhurried pace, even on nights like this, when the rain drummed softly against the roof, and Halloween whispered its presence through the leaves. But tonight, something was different. You were lying in bed, the rain lulling you into a gentle trance, when you noticed the clock had paused. Not stopped exactly, but the ticking seemed slower, stretched out in the silence between the rain. You glanced at the hallway, expecting to see the familiar pendulum swing, but instead, the door to the old grandfather clock was slightly ajar. You'd never seen it open before. Slowly, you got out of bed and made your way toward it, curious but calm. As you stood in front of the clock, you saw something inside, not the usual gears and mechanisms, but a doorway. Faint, but there, behind the pendulum, as if the wood had given way to a space beyond. It wasn't large, just enough to peek through. And on the other side, a room, a small, dimly lit room with a single candle burning on a table. The rain outside grew softer, almost a murmur as you stared into this hidden world. You knew better than to step in, but something about it felt peaceful, like an old memory of a place you'd once been. The clock ticked again, and the door gently closed. The rain returned to its steady rhythm, and the hallway was as it always had been. You smiled, knowing that whatever was on the other side of the clock was patient, waiting for another quiet night like this to show itself again. There was a legend in the village about a pumpkin that could listen. On Halloween, when the rain fell and the air was thick with the scent of wet leaves, children would carve their jack-o'-lanterns, placing them on doorsteps to ward off spirits. But one pumpkin, they said, was different. You had heard the stories, of course, but they always felt like tales to scare children into behaving. Still, tonight, as the rain tapped gently on the windows and the world outside seemed softer, quieter, you decided to test it. You had a pumpkin sitting on your windowsill, carved and glowing faintly with a small candle inside. It wasn't anything special, just an ordinary, slightly crooked jack-o'-lantern. But you sat in front of it, the rain a steady backdrop, and began to talk. Not about anything important, just the kind of thoughts that float around your mind on a rainy night. You told the pumpkin about your day, your plans, your dreams, speaking softly as the rain fell. And for a while, nothing happened. It was just you, the candlelight, and the soft murmur of the storm. But then, just as you were about to head to bed, The flame inside the pumpkin flickered, not like a draft had caught it, but as though the pumpkin had heard you. The flicker was slow, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. You smiled. Maybe it was just the candle, or maybe the pumpkin really had listened. You whispered goodnight to it, feeling oddly comforted, as though the pumpkin had absorbed all your thoughts and worries, leaving you lighter. The rain continued to fall as you crawled back into bed, knowing that on nights like this, even the simplest things might be filled with quiet magic. If you're still awake, make sure you hit that subscribe button, or the spirits might visit your notifications next. Don't forget to like and share, unless you want to keep these eerie tales all to yourself. Happy haunting, and remember, the scariest stories are yet to come.